Today we're going to be creating a beautiful bracelet using one of the glass bead strands from Jesse James Beads. These Jesse James Bead strands are a work of art all by themselves. They look absolutely stunning, and you can break these apart to make several pieces of jewelry, or you can string them exactly the way that they are. Just restring them onto bead stringing wire and you have a beautiful, elegant bracelet, and all you had to do was add a little hardware. For today's project, you're going to need 2 pairs of pliers for opening and closing 2 6mm jump rings. You're going to need a crimper tool for crimping, and you're also going to need a cutter tool to trim some of your bead stringing wire. To create our bracelet, you're going to need 2 6mm jump rings, 2 crimp tubes or crimp beads, as well as a clasp, and you're going to need 10 inches of bead stringing wire. I am using gold 19 strand bead stringing wire for my bracelet. To get started, thread one of your crimp beads onto the end of your bead stringing wire and drop that down about 1.5 inches to 2 inches. Take the end of your bead stringing wire and loop it through one of your 6mm jump rings, and take the tail end of your wire and stick it back through your crimp bead or your crimp tube. Pull the crimp bead or the crimp tube down close to your jump ring, but leave yourself a little bit of wiggle room. You want a little loop left in that bead stringing wire. Now we're ready to crimp our crimp bead. Before you place the crimp bead into the crimper tool, make sure that the 2 bead stringing wires are running parallel within the crimp tube and are not crisscrossing over each other inside that bead. Place the crimp bead into the back notch of the crimper tool. That's the one that is closest to your hands, and squeeze. After that initial crimp, you should be able to see the 2 wires separated by the crimping of the bead in the center. That's separating out both of the wires within that bead so that they are not touching each other and not creating any abrasion within the crimp bead or crimp tube. Now we're ready to take the crimp tube or crimp bead and put it in the first notch of the crimper tool. That's the one furthest away from your hand, closest to the outer portion of the tool. Place the crimp bead or the crimp tube sideways within that notch and squeeze. Using that first notch of the crimper tool is just going to help make your crimp a little bit more compact and very tidy. Now you are ready to trim off your tail. Now we're ready to thread our beads onto our bead stringing wire. I'm going to restring all of my beads in the exact pattern that they already have that was so meticulously created at Jesse James Beads. Once you've thread all of your beads onto the bead stringing wire, we're ready to create the clasp section of the bracelet. So we're just going to open a 6mm jump ring and thread on our clasp and close that jump ring back. To complete our bracelet, we're going to follow the same steps that we did at the very beginning. So we are going to take a crimp bead or crimp tube and thread that on to the end of our bead stringing wire and loop that wire through the 6mm jump ring that is containing our clasp. And you want to take the tail end of that wire and stick it back through the crimp bead and pull everything down so that your crimp and your clasp are close to the end of your bead strand. Leaving yourself a little bit of wiggle room between the crimp tube or crimp bead and the 6mm jump ring, we're ready to crimp. But before we crimp, we want to be sure that the 2 bead stringing wires that are running through the crimp bead are parallel and not crisscrossing each other inside the crimp bead. And an easy way to make sure that that is the case is to take the tail end of your bead stringing wire and thread it through at least 2 of the beads on the end of your strand. That way you can separate out the strands and you can really get close to that crimp bead, and you don't have the tail end of your bead stringing wire in the way, so you can really make sure that those 2 wires are not crossed. Take your crimper tool, place the crimp into the back notch of the crimper tool and squeeze, and take that same crimp and place it in the top front notch of the crimper tool and squeeze, just to tidy up that crimp. Now we're ready to trim our bead stringing wire where it is exiting our beads. Once you've cut the bead stringing wire, you have a beautiful glass bead bracelet featuring all of the most beautiful Jesse James beads.